"Sir, if you sign that, you may not be running this company tomorrow." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of tailored suits shifting around the long walnut conference table, but they landed like something heavier than sound, something that bent the air itself, and for the briefest second, Daniel Whitmore's pen stopped half an inch above the final signature line of a $2 billion acquisition, the silver tip hovering in the reflection of polished wood while 12 executives watched him with the calm confidence of people who believed the outcome was already decided. The room sat on the 32nd floor overlooking downtown Chicago, sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling glass and cutting long rectangular shapes across the carpet, the skyline shimmering in the distance while inside the temperature stayed cool, controlled, deliberate, everything about the environment designed to reinforce certainty, authority, and power. And yet that certainty cracked ever so slightly as Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes toward the source of the voice, a young black girl standing near the far end of the table, just beside the wall where assistants usually kept silent, her posture straight but unassuming, her hands lightly folded in front of her, her badge catching a thin stripe of sunlight that reflected faintly against her navy cardigan. Her name read Ava Johnson, and she looked younger than everyone else in the room by at least 15 years. Her presence so quiet that most of the executives hadn't even noticed her until she spoke, which made the interruption feel even more unexpected, like a ripple in still water, and Whitmore's lips curved into a faint, controlled smile, the kind he used when someone stepped outside their place without realizing it, the kind that usually ended conversations before they started, his gaze calm but distant as if measuring whether the interruption deserved acknowledgement at all, while one of the senior partners leaned back slightly, glancing toward Ava with mild confusion, and another executive tapped his tablet, pretending not to notice, the silence stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable, just long enough for the weight of hierarchy to settle back into place. Whitmore tilted his head slightly, his voice measured and even. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" Ava didn't move, didn't shift her weight, her voice still soft but steady as she nodded once. "Yes, sir. I think there's a clause that transfers liability entirely to your side if the integration fails," and the words drifted gently across the room, not loud, not confrontational, just precise, like she was describing something obvious, something factual, something that didn't belong to emotion or ego, and yet the temperature of the room seemed to drop another degree as several executives exchanged quick glances, one of them narrowing his eyes at the contract resting in front of Whitmore, another letting out a quiet breath through his nose, almost a silent laugh, while Whitmore's smile remained, though it tightened just slightly at the edges, the pen still hovering above the paper, unmoving, as if time itself had paused to listen. Outside, a reflection of sunlight shifted across the glass, casting a faint glow across Ava's face, highlighting the calm in her expression, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't trying to challenge authority, only trying to be heard. And for a moment, Whitmore studied her more carefully, as if noticing her fully for the first time, her calm presence, the absence of nerves, the way she stood without stepping forward or back, simply occupying her space without apology, and somewhere in the stillness, the faint smile on his face began to thin, almost imperceptibly, as the pen in his hand remained suspended above the page, the signature unfinished, the silence growing heavier with every passing second. Whitmore did not sign, but he also did not lower the pen, and the room remained suspended in that delicate moment where authority waited to decide whether to dismiss or to listen, while Ava Johnson stood quietly near the wall, aware of the subtle shifts in posture around her, the faint scrape of a leather chair, the soft tapping of a finger against a tablet, the restrained impatience of executives who were accustomed to decisions moving forward without interruption, and yet she did not retreat, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes focused not on the people in the room but on the document itself, as if the paper mattered more than the hierarchy surrounding it. Just an hour earlier she had been on the 28th floor organizing archived files for the compliance department, a temporary assignment given to her because she was known for reading carefully and never rushing, a habit she had built long before she ever stepped into this glass tower, growing up in a modest apartment on the south side where her mother worked 2 jobs, mornings at a community clinic and evenings cleaning office buildings downtown, including this very one, and Ava often waited in the lobby after school, finishing homework under the soft yellow glow of recessed lights while security guards nodded in recognition, her backpack resting beside polished marble floors that reflected the city lights outside. And over time she had become familiar with quiet spaces, with listening more than speaking, with observing details that others overlooked, because details mattered when you did not have influence, when you only had awareness. She had earned a partial scholarship to a state university 2 years earlier, studying business law with careful determination, but when her mother developed complications that required frequent appointments, Ava reduced her course load and took part-time work. Eventually accepting a temporary administrative role at Whitmore Holdings, not glamorous, not permanent, but stable enough to help with rent and medical bills, and she approached each task with the same calm discipline, reading documents, organizing folders, learning the rhythms of the building, the quiet language of professionals who moved quickly and spoke in measured tones. And that morning, while delivering revised compliance binders to the conference floor, she noticed the draft agreement. Left open on the side credenza, the heading bold, the number significant, the language dense but familiar enough to draw her attention, and she had not intended to read more than a glance, yet one paragraph caught her eye, the phrasing subtle, almost hidden in standard legal wording, transferring post-acquisition liabilities under certain contingencies, and her stomach tightened slightly, not from fear but from recognition, the kind that came from hours spent studying case law late at night while the city hummed outside her apartment window. Now, back in the present, the executives shifted again, and one of them leaned forward, glancing at Ava with a faint smile that suggested polite dismissal. While Whitmore still studied her, the faint reflection of the skyline visible in the glass behind him, his expression controlled, composed, yet no longer entirely confident, as if something about her calm presence unsettled the usual rhythm of certainty, and Ava remained still, her voice no longer speaking, her role finished, the decision no longer hers, but the silence she had created lingered in the room like a quiet weight, and the pen in Whitmore's hand still hovered above the page, unmoving. Daniel Whitmore finally lowered the pen, but he did not set it down, his fingers still holding the polished silver barrel while he leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath the controlled movement, and for the first time since the meeting began, the momentum of the room shifted away from certainty and into evaluation. His gaze drifting briefly across the faces of his executive team before returning to the document in front of him, the sunlight now sliding further across the table as the afternoon edged forward, the city skyline beyond the glass glowing with a pale autumn brightness that contrasted with the tightening atmosphere inside the room. Whitmore was known for decisive leadership, a man who rarely hesitated, a reputation built over 2 decades of calculated risks and aggressive expansions that had turned Whitmore Holdings into one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the Midwest. And the executives around the table trusted that instinct. Trusted the quiet confidence that usually guided him without second-guessing, yet now that instinct seemed to pause, and he flipped the document back several pages, his eyes scanning lines of legal text with renewed focus, the faint smile that once rested on his face now replaced by a neutral stillness, the kind that suggested he was listening to something beyond the room, beyond the voices of advisors, beyond the expectations of profit margins and quarterly projections. Across the table, Jonathan Pierce, the senior mergers director, shifted slightly in his chair, his cufflinks catching a narrow beam of sunlight as he leaned forward, his tone calm but edged with impatience. "Daniel, we have reviewed this agreement for 3 weeks, he said carefully, choosing words that maintained respect while reinforcing confidence. The risk exposure is minimal and the upside is significant, and a few heads nodded subtly, reinforcing the consensus that had formed long before Ava spoke, the collective confidence of professionals accustomed to moving quickly once alignment had been reached. Whitmore did not answer immediately, his eyes still moving across the page, and the silence stretched again, longer this time, while Ava remained near the wall, her presence quiet but no longer invisible, several executives now aware of her in a way they had not been moments earlier, as if her words had shifted her from background to participant without her taking a single step forward. Whitmore finally spoke, his voice measured. "Which section did you notice?" And the question floated toward Ava without him looking directly at her, a subtle test of both her confidence and her understanding. And Ava responded calmly, "Page 14, subsection C, near the end of the integration clause," her tone steady, not defensive, not proud, simply precise, and Whitmore turned to the indicated page, his fingers smoothing the edge of the document, while Jonathan Pierce glanced briefly at the same section on his tablet, his expression still composed but slightly tighter now, the faintest crease forming near his eyes. The room grew quieter still as Whitmore read, his brow lowering almost imperceptibly, the faint hum of the air conditioning now the only sound filling the space, and outside the glass, a cloud drifted slowly across the skyline, softening the sunlight and casting a muted glow across the conference table, while Ava stood with the same calm posture, her hands still folded lightly, her expression unchanged, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome followed, and as Whitmore continued reading, the absence of his smile became more noticeable, the confidence that once filled the room now replaced by a quiet, growing uncertainty that settled gently but firmly over everyone present. Whitmore's eyes slowed as he reached the final lines of subsection C, the faint crease in his brow deepening almost imperceptibly, and he read the paragraph again, this time more carefully, the words no longer blending into standard legal language but separating into meaning, into consequences, into something that no longer felt routine, and the silence in the room stretched until it felt almost deliberate, as if everyone sensed the shift but no one wanted to acknowledge it first. Jonathan Pierce leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firmer now. "Daniel, that clause is standard for transitional liability," he said, though his tone carried a subtle tension that had not been there before, while another executive adjusted his glasses and glanced down at his tablet, scrolling quietly, the faint tapping sound unusually loud against the stillness, and Whitmore did not respond, his fingers lightly pressing against the page as he traced the wording again, his shoulders remaining still but his expression gradually tightening. Ava stood where she had been, her presence steady, her breathing even, the sunlight now softer as clouds filtered the afternoon light, casting a muted glow across the polished wood and reflecting faintly along the edges of Whitmore's watch, and she did not speak again, allowing the silence to work, allowing the document to say what it needed to say. Whitmore flipped back one page, then forward again, his voice finally breaking the quiet, low and measured. "This transfers post-integration litigation exposure entirely to our side if performance metrics are disputed," and the statement landed gently but heavily, the tone of someone realizing the implications as he spoke them aloud, and Jonathan Pierce shifted again, the faintest hesitation appearing in his posture. "Only under limited conditions," he replied, though he now leaned closer to his tablet, reviewing the language more carefully, while another executive cleared his throat softly, glancing at the printed agreement in front of him, the confidence that filled the room earlier now replaced with cautious attention. Whitmore leaned back slightly, the pen now resting loosely between his fingers, no longer poised to sign, and he looked toward Ava for the first time directly, his expression neutral but searching, as if trying to understand how someone standing quietly near the wall had noticed what an entire legal team had not, and Ava met his gaze calmly, her voice soft but clear. "It becomes active if projected integration costs exceed baseline assumptions, sir, which they often do during cross-market acquisitions," and her explanation was not dramatic, not challenging, simply factual, the tone of someone who had studied patterns rather than personalities, and several executives exchanged brief glances, one of them scrolling faster now, another reaching for a printed copy, the quiet movement of paper and screens replacing the earlier stillness. Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly, not with frustration but with concentration, and he leaned forward again, reading the clause one more time, his pen now set gently on the table, the small metallic sound barely audible but noticeable, and outside the glass windows, the skyline shimmered faintly as the afternoon light shifted again, while inside, the atmosphere had changed completely, the certainty gone, replaced by something slower, more careful, more deliberate, and the absence of Whitmore's earlier smile now felt unmistakable, as if the room itself had recognized that something important had just shifted, something that could not easily be dismissed. The quiet in the room did not ease, it tightened, becoming heavier as more executives began reviewing the same clause, the soft glow of tablet screens reflecting in polished wood while printed pages shifted quietly across the table, and Jonathan Pierce's confident posture softened just slightly as he leaned closer to his screen, scrolling back and forth through the integration assumptions, his jaw tightening as he read the fine print that had once seemed routine. Whitmore remained still, his hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes focused but distant, the measured calm of a leader now replaced with careful evaluation, and after several long seconds he spoke again, his voice low. "What happens if integration costs exceed projections by 15%, and the question hung in the air, not directed at anyone in particular, but demanding an answer. And Jonathan Pierce responded slowly, "Then the liability allocation activates," though his tone lacked the certainty he carried earlier, while another executive, Margaret Lawson, quietly adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, her finger tracing the document that would shift legal exposure entirely to Whitmore Holdings. She added softly, and the statement landed with a quiet weight that settled across the room. Ava remained still near the wall, her posture unchanged, her calm presence contrasting the subtle tension building among the executives, and Whitmore's gaze drifted briefly toward her again, then back to the document, his fingers tapping lightly once against the table, a small sound that seemed louder in the silence. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat softly, attempting to recover control of the narrative. "The projections are conservative," he said carefully. "We have accounted for potential overruns." But Margaret Lawson did not immediately agree, her eyes still scanning the financial assumptions. "The baseline assumes stable vendor contracts," she replied, "but the acquisition includes 3 international suppliers," and her voice slowed slightly as she read further. "If those contracts shift, the exposure increases significantly," and another executive leaned forward, glancing between them, the quiet collaboration replacing earlier certainty. Whitmore leaned back slightly, his expression now serious, his earlier smile completely gone, replaced by a stillness that suggested calculation rather than confidence, and outside the windows the clouds had thickened, softening the sunlight further, the city skyline muted behind the glass, while inside the room the atmosphere grew more deliberate, more cautious. Ava's eyes rested briefly on the document again, not speaking, not stepping forward, her role finished, yet her presence still influencing the pace of the room, and Whitmore finally reached forward and closed the document halfway, the sound of paper shifting quietly across the table. "We need to review this further," he said calmly, and the statement changed everything. The decision to pause a $2 billion signature signaling that certainty had given way to caution, and Jonathan Pierce nodded slowly, though the tightness in his expression remained, while Margaret Lawson leaned back slightly, her eyes thoughtful, and Whitmore's gaze moved once more toward Ava, his expression no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but thoughtful, as if recognizing that the quiet voice from the edge of the room had just altered the direction of the entire meeting. The decision settled over the room like a quiet shift in weather, subtle but unmistakable, and Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his fingers loosely interlocked as he looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows where the Chicago skyline now sat beneath a soft layer of gray clouds. The sunlight diffused into a calm, muted glow that softened the sharp edges of nearby buildings, and for several seconds no one spoke, the executives quietly reviewing their documents while the hum of the air conditioning filled the silence, steady and almost soothing. Yet beneath that calm there was a new awareness, a recognition that something important had just changed. Ava Johnson remained near the wall, her posture relaxed but attentive, her hands still lightly folded, and she felt the tension in the room ease slightly, not disappear, but transform into something quieter, more thoughtful. And she lowered her gaze briefly toward the polished floor where reflections of glass and light stretched across the carpet in faint patterns, her breathing slow and controlled as she allowed the moment to unfold without adding to it. Whitmore's eyes moved slowly across the table, observing his team, watching Margaret Lawson reviewing her notes with careful precision, Jonathan Pierce scrolling through revised projections, and another executive quietly marking a printed page with a pen, the room no longer driven by urgency but by consideration. And Whitmore finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "Let us take 10 minutes, and the statement carried a quiet authority that shifted everyone gently out of the immediate decision, chairs moving softly as executives gathered tablets and documents, some stepping toward the windows, others speaking quietly in low voices, the tension dissolving into controlled movement. Ava remained where she was, uncertain whether to step forward or leave, and after a moment she turned slightly toward the side table, placing the compliance binders she had been holding neatly beside a stack of documents, her movements careful and quiet, while outside the windows a faint breeze moved across the river below, barely visible but suggested by the slow drift of clouds, and Whitmore stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with a small, deliberate motion, his gaze briefly returning to Ava, not with authority or dismissal, but with quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand how a calm voice from the edge of the room had influenced the direction of a decision worth billions. And Ava met his glance briefly, then lowered her eyes respectfully, her expression calm, not seeking recognition, only maintaining composure. And Whitmore walked toward the windows, pausing there as he looked out over the city, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, the skyline stretching miles beyond, and the silence between them remained unspoken but meaningful, the kind that carried more weight than conversation, while behind them the executives continued their quiet discussions, and the room settled into a softer rhythm, the tension replaced by reflection, the decision delayed, and the absence of Whitmore's earlier smile now felt complete, replaced by a thoughtful stillness that suggested something deeper had begun to shift. 10 minutes passed quietly, but the atmosphere that returned to the room felt different, slower, more deliberate, as Daniel Whitmore walked back toward the table with measured steps, his reflection briefly gliding across the glass wall before he took his seat again, and one by one the executives followed, their earlier confidence now replaced with careful attention, tablets reopening, documents repositioned, the soft sounds of movement fading as the room settled once more. Whitmore placed both hands lightly on the table, his gaze moving across the document again, then toward Margaret Lawson. "Your assessment," he said calmly, and she adjusted her glasses, her voice steady but thoughtful. "If integration costs shift even moderately, we assume full exposure for any litigation tied to operational delays, which could extend beyond projected margins," and the words landed with quiet clarity, while Jonathan Pierce leaned forward, his earlier assurance now tempered. "We did not anticipate that level of exposure," he admitted carefully, scrolling through revised projections on his tablet, and another executive, Robert Klein, flipped through printed pages, his finger pausing as he reached the financial summary. "If this activates, it affects not only the acquisition but future credit positioning," he added softly, and Whitmore nodded once, absorbing the implications without interruption. Ava remained near the wall, her calm posture unchanged, though she noticed the subtle shift in tone, the absence of dismissal, the quiet recognition now present in every voice, and Whitmore's gaze briefly lifted toward her again, thoughtful, measuring. Before returning to the document, Margaret Lawson leaned forward slightly, her voice careful but firm. "This clause would not have triggered if the liability threshold remained shared, but this language removes that balance," and Jonathan Pierce exhaled softly, the realization settling across his expression. "That would place us in a vulnerable position during the first 6 months," he admitted, and Whitmore reached forward, closing the document completely this time. The sound of paper sliding gently across polished wood, his voice calm but decisive. "Then we do not sign today," and the statement settled across the room with quiet finality, the tension easing slightly but replaced by reflection, and Whitmore leaned back, his eyes moving once more toward Ava, no longer distant, no longer dismissive, but acknowledging, as if the quiet voice from the edge of the room had become impossible to overlook. Ava met his gaze briefly, her expression still calm, respectful, and Whitmore studied her for a moment, then asked quietly, "How long have you been reviewing compliance materials?" And Ava answered softly, "Part-time for a few months, sir," her tone modest, factual, and Whitmore nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, while the executives exchanged brief glances, the realization now fully formed that a decision worth billions had shifted because someone who was never meant to speak had chosen to do so quietly. And outside the windows the clouds began to thin slightly, a soft line of sunlight breaking across the skyline, reflecting faintly across the glass and settling into the room as the moment of recognition completed its quiet turn. The room remained quiet after Whitmore's decision, the weight of the paused deal still lingering in the air, but the tension had softened into something more reflective, more human, as Daniel Whitmore leaned slightly forward, his hands resting calmly on the polished table, his eyes shifting toward Ava Johnson again with a thoughtful expression that carried none of the earlier distance, and the sunlight breaking through the clouds now stretched gently across the glass walls, creating soft reflections that moved slowly along the floor, while the skyline beyond seemed calmer, as if mirroring the change inside the room. Whitmore spoke quietly, "You noticed that without being part of the review team," and Ava nodded once, her voice steady. "Yes, sir. I was organizing compliance binders earlier and saw the draft left open," her tone respectful, not defensive, and Whitmore studied her for a moment longer, as if measuring more than her words, measuring her calm, her composure, her willingness to speak without seeking recognition. And Margaret Lawson glanced toward Ava as well, her expression thoughtful, while Jonathan Pierce leaned back slightly, his posture no longer rigid but reflective. Whitmore nodded slowly. "You prevented us from making a costly mistake," he said, his voice calm but sincere, and the acknowledgement shifted the room again, subtle but meaningful, as several executives exchanged brief glances, recognizing the quiet importance of the moment, and Ava lowered her gaze slightly, her response soft. "I only pointed out what I saw, sir," and Whitmore's expression softened almost imperceptibly, as if the humility in her answer reinforced his impression. He reached for the closed document, sliding it slightly aside, then continued, "What is your role here, exactly?" And Ava answered, "Temporary administrative support for compliance, sir," her tone modest, factual, and Whitmore nodded again, absorbing the simplicity of the answer, while Margaret Lawson leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but curious. "Do you have training in business law?" And Ava hesitated briefly before responding. "I studied part-time at Illinois State University, ma'am, but I paused my classes last year, and the admission was quiet." Without explanation, yet it carried enough meaning to deepen the silence for a moment, and Whitmore's gaze softened further, the recognition growing clearer, while Jonathan Pierce glanced down at his tablet again, his earlier confidence now replaced with quiet respect. Whitmore leaned back slightly, his voice calm and measured. "Well, Miss Johnson, your attention to detail has already made an impact today," and Ava nodded respectfully, her hand still lightly folded, her posture unchanged, and the sunlight across the table brightened slightly as the clouds shifted again, casting a gentle warmth into the room, while the executives gathered their notes, the earlier urgency replaced with thoughtful calm, and Whitmore's gaze lingered briefly on Ava once more, not as a passing presence but as someone now fully seen, the quiet acknowledgement settling between them without further words, and the room, once driven by momentum and certainty, now carried a different energy, one shaped by a quiet voice, a careful observation, and a decision that had changed not only the deal, but the way everyone in the room now looked toward the edge where Ava Johnson still stood. The meeting slowly dissolved into quiet movement as executives gathered their tablets and folders, their voices lowered to thoughtful murmurs, but Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on the table while the late afternoon light stretched across the glass walls, turning the skyline into a soft reflection that shimmered faintly against the polished surface, and Ava Johnson stepped carefully toward the side table, collecting the compliance binders she had brought earlier, her movements calm and deliberate, as if she were returning to the quiet role she had held before the moment shifted everything. Whitmore watched her briefly, not with authority or evaluation, but with a quiet recognition that had not been there before, and as Ava turned toward the door, he spoke gently, "Miss Johnson," and she paused, turning slightly, her posture respectful, her expression composed, while Whitmore rose from his chair, the soft movement of fabric barely audible, and he walked a few steps toward her, stopping at a comfortable distance, the sunlight now resting softly across his shoulder. "Your attention today protected more than a deal," he said calmly, his voice measured, sincere, and Ava nodded slightly, her response quiet. "I am glad I noticed it, sir," and the humility in her tone settled gently between them. Whitmore studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, but thoughtful, and Ava turned toward the door, stepping into the hallway where the lighting shifted to a warm, even glow, the quiet carpet soft beneath her footsteps as she walked forward, the glass walls reflecting her movement faintly as she passed, and behind her the conference room remained calm, the executives continuing their discussions, while Whitmore returned slowly to the window, his reflection faint in the glass as he looked out over the city below, the river winding quietly between buildings, the late afternoon light now softer, calmer, and he exhaled slowly, the absence of his earlier smile replaced by something quieter, more reflective, as if the moment had altered not just a decision, but perspective itself. Ava continued down the hallway, her badge catching a thin line of sunlight as she passed, her footsteps steady, her expression calm, not triumphant, not expectant, simply composed, and the building returned to its usual quiet rhythm, elevators chiming softly in the distance, muted voices drifting from nearby offices, and as Ava reached the corner, she glanced briefly toward the windows where the skyline stretched wide and peaceful, the clouds thinning into gentle light, and she continued forward, her figure gradually fading into the calm of the corridor, while inside the conference room Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, watching the reflection of the city in the glass, the unfinished document resting quietly on the table behind him, and the silence that followed felt complete, the kind that did not need words, only the quiet presence of a decision made, a mistake avoided, and a voice that had changed everything without ever raising itself above a whisper.